In my last lecture, I focused on identity and protest art within the United States. Remember, Puerto Rico is part of the United States, albeit not a fully integrated part. Now we move back into the wider world. We talked about a book from the sky briefly at the end of our mop-up unit on Asian art, just before Christmas break. So let's recap. What political context do these two works have in common? They're both about the Cultural Revolution. The lithograph on the right is pure propaganda art, designed to inspire the faithful to support Chairman Mao's efforts to instill revolutionary purity, by force if necessary, even though the poster itself is very unthreatening. A book from the sky is widely interpreted as a protest against the Cultural Revolution, although it carries deeper and more confusing meanings. I found an interesting video on Xu Bing and his work. As always, the whole video is up on Moodle, but I'm going to let this excerpt serve as my main lecture on this work. So this work is a commentary on language and its manipulation, on mass production and commercialism, and on government propaganda from Mao's Little Red Book on. And maybe it's also a frustrated rebel's commentary on our inability to communicate, or at least to communicate the truth. But one of the reasons I like this artist is he didn't really give up on language or on communication. One of his projects during an 18-year stay in New York was English calligraphy. Can you read this banner? Designed by Xu Bing and hanging outside the Met? It says Art for the People. The artist returned to China in 1988. Here we see a more recent work, both a tribute to traditional Chinese landscape painting and an imaginative recycling project intended to draw attention to China's rampant pollution. The painting is in fact images shaped from waste into the form of a landscape seen through frosted glass. When viewers walk around the so-called painting, they encounter trash. So here's another required installation artwork by a Chinese artist, and another example of social and political commentary. There are really two remarkable facts that you need to remember about these sunflower seeds. One, I gave away in the label of the previous slide. The seeds are made of porcelain, hand-painted. Just as remarkably, in fact, each seed is hand-painted and individual. They may look alike, but like sunflower seeds in nature, each is subtly different and individual. So let's watch a couple of brief clips from a video that the Tate Gallery produced about this work. You will see and hear from the artist himself. Here's what the Tate website has to say about the point that the artist is trying to make with this work. Quote, "Sunflower seeds invites us to look more closely at the made in China phenomenon and the geopolitics of cultural and economic exchange today." The commentary continues, "The precious nature of the material, that is porcelain, the effort of production, and the narrative and personal content create a powerful commentary on the human condition. What does it mean to be an individual in today's society? Are we insignificant or powerless unless we act together? What do our increasing desires, materialism, and number mean for society, the environment, and the future?" By the way, the Tate stopped allowing people to walk on the seeds when the museum discovered that this was spewing potentially hazardous ceramic dust into the air. And yes, this work is also about the Cultural Revolution. Propaganda images from the time often depicted Chairman Mao as the sun and the mass of people as sunflowers turning toward him. I've got some examples here. Yet, and I'm quoting the Tate website again, the artist remembers the sharing of sunflower seeds as a gesture of human compassion, providing a space for pleasure, friendship, and kindness during a time of extreme poverty, repression, and uncertainty. So, sunflower seeds represent propaganda, poverty, community, friendship, all at the same time. They're a potent symbol. So how are the political messages of these works similar and different? It seems to me that both works represent a commentary on propaganda and the manipulation of symbols and the use of language during the Cultural Revolution. Both showcase traditional Chinese arts and, at least indirectly, therefore, are criticizing the culture of mass production. Both offer employment for people with traditional skills, such as carving woodcut blocks and creating and painting porcelain. But Xu Bing's work is deliberately mysterious, even uncommunicative. It holds a lot of words, but no meaning. even if the Chinese communist authorities were certain that the books from the sky had to contain some kind of subversive secret code. Sunflower seeds, by contrast, carry multiple meanings for the viewer, especially the Chinese viewer. Yet these meanings are much less disguised and maybe more optimistic as well. I should note that one further similarity is that both artists suffered from political upheaval in their youth. Xu Bing was exiled to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution. Ai Weiwei, as a child, was exiled with his father, a well-known poet, to a labor camp in the Gobi Desert. Both artists later got into trouble with the Chinese communist authorities. After the 1989 Tiananmen Square revolt, see the student victims in this photo, the Chinese authorities turned against new wave artists like Xu Bing, and in 1990 he left for America. But he returned in 2008 to assume a prominent government art post. Like Xu Bing, Ai Weiwei also spent a number of years in New York, and he also decided to return to China. But he was arrested in 2011 and placed in detention for 81 days. The authorities also confiscated his passport, which meant he could not travel outside of China. As the photo indicates, the passport was returned to him in 2015. I always look for other works by the same artist, both because I'm curious and because I want to give you a heads up on possible attribution questions. I don't think you'll get one here because, as you can see from this handful of examples, Ai Weiwei's installation sculptures are extraordinarily varied. But to some extent, it seems to me that all of them highlight the contrast between a rich tradition of handcrafted work and the rise of globalized mass production, which is so associated with China. We talked about this work before a long time ago. This short museum video clip should serve as a refresher, and I predict you will enjoy the performance art. So in terms of content, what does our corned beef can bowl have in common with sunflower seeds? I think they're both commentaries on the loss of indigenous or national traditions in the face of economic globalization. By the way, both works might also fit into a loose category known as conceptual art, a term I encounter a lot but haven't really talked about. The Tate defines conceptual art as art for which the idea or concept behind the work is more important than the finished art object. What's the classic work from our required works that fits that definition? The fountain. The video and your reading point out that tinned corned beef has replaced local foods within the Pacific Island diet and is commonly given as a gift at weddings, funerals, feasts, and other special occasions. But the canned meat is high in fat and cholesterol, so it contributes to a huge obesity and diabetes problem in the islands. The introduction of cattle, likewise, has changed and many people argue degraded the sensitive ecosystem of the Pacific Islands. Cattle use a great deal of water, they pollute rivers and produce methane gas, and land for pasture is being deforested. So why does the term 2000 appear in a work that was produced in 1994? I did not have a clue. So I did some research. One scholarly article reported, and I quote, "The 2000 in the title suggested millennial fantasies," that is, fantasies of the end of the world, and brought to mind stereotypic cargo cult practices, which raises another question. What is a cargo cult? That one I did know. When Pacific Islanders who had only Stone Age technology first encountered Europeans and saw the vast array of goods that Europeans brought with them, a few islanders started worshiping these goods or the people who produced them. Some of these so-called cargo cults that emerged believed that spirits would bring them similar goods at some point in the future. That's the millenarian aspect, the end of the world, the end times, the promised future. Sometimes members of these cults would use local materials to construct fetishes of European goods. So here are some cargo cult photos. As you might guess, many of the first contacts were made during the Pacific campaigns of World War II. Again, we see the ambiguity in the artist's message. Are outsiders inflicting health, economic, and ecological catastrophes on Pacific Islanders, or by purchasing and valuing Pisupo, are Pacific Islanders bringing these catastrophes on themselves? I realize I'm including a lot of videos, but in this last unit, we have the exciting opportunity to hear artists speak for themselves. Wonderful as it is to hear, say, Simon Schama talking about Rembrandt, imagine being able to hear Rembrandt talk about Rembrandt. So hang in there and watch this excerpt from the artist's TED Talk. It will give you an opportunity to see many other works in the series. So what's the content of this artwork? What is it about? I figured you should know what the words on the face said, so I looked them up and included them in your reading. Once you knew something about the poet and knew what the poem said, did you look at the work differently? The artist considers herself an opponent of the current political regime in Iran. Some of her works, particularly her films, are more clearly hostile to the Islamic government. So why all the guns? Is she criticizing women for embracing violence? Or is she admiring their strength and determination? Or maybe both? Here's another work from the same series with a poem by the same author. So how do you interpret the titles of these two works? Are women silenced by the Islamic Revolution, or are they empowered? Or both? This deliberate ambiguity has brought a lot of criticism down on the artist. The Iranian leadership views her work as dangerous and subversive, but outsiders are often uncomfortable with what seems to be an admiration for violence. So what do you think? Here's another work from the same series with a poem by a different author, this time a modernist feminist, now deceased, whose writings have been strongly condemned by the Islamic regime. And maybe this, too, is the silenced voice of women. Well, this was one of your summer works, which seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? It's also the last work for today. And maybe I'm getting a little punchy because what really struck me when I started doing more research into this work is that much of the commentary I encountered in the press wasn't about the work's meaning. It was about guessing how the work was actually made. Specifically, how in the world did the Tate Gallery install a huge crack down the center of a gallery floor? So here is the official Tate Gallery statement. The artist and Tate are not going into great detail other than to say we opened up the turbine hall floor in order to create a cavity. The work was made with utmost precision according to the drawings by the artist, and nothing was accidental. Well, that set the press into a frenzy of investigative journalism, and I read several articles about builders who were interviewed about possible techniques. Here's one of the articles. Mr. E is a builder who was working at the Tate Modern on another project while Shibboleth was being installed. And although for contractual reasons he does not wish to be further identified, he's happy to recount what he witnessed. And here's a quote from him. They dug a dirty great trench about a yard wide and a yard deep, says Mr. E, lost in wonderment. Then they brought in a lorry load after lorry load of cement, lorries are trucks, and poured it in using 10-foot sections of what looked like carved polystyrene molding to form the sides. Then a whole bunch of people lay down on their stomachs for about a week and finished it off with brushes. Looked bloody uncomfortable, I can tell you. It's about racism. Can't see it myself, but I'm not much of a one for modern art. It's a pretty good trench, though, and one hell of a lot of cement. Good luck to him. I thought that was fun. The meaning is probably less mysterious than the medium. I'll tell you what the author says in a minute, but first, what do you think it means? Okay, here's from the Tate website. Salcedo is addressing a long legacy of racism and colonialism that underlies the modern world. A shibboleth is a custom phrase or use of language that acts as a test of belonging to a particular social group or class. By definition, it's used to exclude those deemed unsuitable to join this group. But you guys can do better than that, right? Where does the word come from? Check out the book of Judges in the Bible, chapter 12. To continue the commentary from the Tate, the history of racism, Salcedo writes, runs parallel to the history of modernity and its untold dark side. For hundreds of years, Western ideas of progress and prosperity have been underpinned by colonial exploitation and the withdrawal of basic rights from others. Our own time remains defined by the existence of a huge, socially excluded underclass in Western as well as post-colonial societies. In breaking open the floor of the museum, Salcedo is exposing a fracture in modernity itself. And here's what the artist told the BBC. Shibboleth represents borders, the experience of immigrants, the experience of segregation, the experience of racial hatred. It is the experience of a third world person coming into the heart of Europe. Dora Salcedo was born in Colombia in South America and continues to live and work in Bogota. At last, we have a global artist who has not moved to London or New York, although she did earn a Master's of Fine Arts at NYU. Her art is deeply influenced by Colombia's troubled past, which includes not only the legacy of colonialism, but also dictatorship, drug wars, and an ongoing civil war. So let's hear briefly from the artist. What you see on this slide is perhaps the most famous of her installations. On the 6th and 7th of November 1985, members of a guerrilla group took over the Palace of Justice in Colombia's capital, Bogota, and held the Supreme Court hostage. The siege lasted 53 hours, and almost half of the 25 Supreme Court justices died in the attack. 17 years later, Salcedo lowered wooden chairs against the facade of the new Palace of Justice. The installation took over 53 hours, the length of the siege, and Salcedo described it as, quote, an act of memory, unquote. It's not a required work, but I actually find it more interesting. Next up in our headlong dash through global contemporary art will be feminist art.